So God will use our less than ideal circumstance for his purposes. There is always a purpose in our situation. And because Paul and Silas were obedient and understood and were open to being used by God, even while in prison, they kept a good attitude in their prayers and singing out loud for all to hear them. God was able to use their obedience to perform a miracle and give them an opportunity to preach the gospel regardless of their chains. So any one of us would have just thrown in the towel and said, screw this, right? God told me to come here, and now I've been beaten and thrown into prison for doing what God told me to do. Screw this, right? But no, that was not Paul and Silas's attitude. And because they still saw opportunity, they still saw the opportunity and not the opposition, God was able to continue to work through them. They didn't see opposition. They continually saw opportunity, and God was continually able to work through them because they never skipped a beat. First Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 16 says, always be joyful. And in verse 17, it says, never stop praying. And in verse 18, it says, be thankful in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you who belong to Jesus Christ. First Thessalonians 5, 16 through 18. So we are to always be joyful and to never stop praying and be thankful in all circumstances. And that's exactly what Paul and Silas did, and God was able to use it because of their obedience. Romans 8:28 says, and we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. Romans 8:28. So whatever situation you face, God can use it for good. He can bring it all together for good, regardless of what the circumstance may be. And we are all guilty of seeing our limitations and missing out on the opportunity that God has given us because it doesn't look how we think it should. I'm sure Paul and Silas did not anticipate. I'm sure their vision board on the way to Macedonia didn't include getting beaten and thrown into prison, but that's where they found themselves. But they did not let it stop them. So just because what God has told us don't line up with what's on our vision board, like I said, I don't have a physical vision board, but I have a mental one. And nothing's going according to anything that I saw on my mental vision board. That doesn't mean that God is not still working through the opposition that we face. So we see that the Apostle Paul and Silas did not allow their circumstance to stop them, and they were continuously being used by God in spite of their circumstance. And we are all guilty of seeing only our limitations and missing out on the opportunity that God has given us because it doesn't look how we think that it should. Your open door will more than likely not look how you think it. Your open door may be the opposite of what you thought, like your place of work and maybe your family. It's not going to necessarily look how we thought it would. Maybe it's that stranger that you come across at a gas station, a parking lot, at the mall. It may not be glamorous, but it's still just as important. You see, we are all surrounded by open doors, but we miss them because we keep knocking on closed doors or just stand there and wait for that door to open again. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 9 says, there is a wide open door for a great work here, although many oppose me. Who wrote that? The Apostle Paul. We're in Acts 16, and that book is written by Luke, and he's talking about Paul in Acts 16. But the Apostle Paul wrote the majority of the New Testament. And in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 9, the Apostle Paul says, there is a wide open door for a great work here, although many oppose me. So in the face of opposition, the Apostle Paul still saw an open door all throughout his ministry. And we know as Christians that the Apostle Paul was opposed from beginning to his death, right? This wasn't the only time he was beaten and thrown into prison. The Apostle Paul ran into opposition the whole way. And in the face of opposition, Paul still saw an open door. He still saw an opportunity to preach the gospel regardless of the people's response. That's something that I've had to deal with. Regardless of response, I have just got to keep preaching the gospel. If they came to Christ, great. If he was thrown into prison, that's fine. I'll just preach there also. If they beat me within an inch of my life, that's fine as well. I'll keep on preaching. We as Christians in the 21st century here in the United States of America, we do not suffer how Paul does. There are Christians who are being persecuted just like this in other parts of the world. But here in America, we live in a fairy tale world. we have a soft Christianity. We don't suffer how Paul did, but yet we quit so easily. And Paul was beaten within an inch of his life on many occasions, thrown into prison on many occasions, and nothing ever made him quit. We view opposition as a closed door. We view lack of support as a closed door. Look at me. Just look at me, for example. This is something that I've struggled with for a little over 3 years. I'm doing all this on my own. I've got no support. I can count on my hand the people that I know who support me, and that's my wife, my son, my mom, my sister, and my brother-in-law. 5 people that I can count on my hand. That's my circle of trust that my dad always talked about, right? And of course, my Father in heaven, my dad, who you see back there on the wall, my earthly father who's gone on to be with the Lord. I can count on one hand the people here on earth who I know support me. Are there others? Yeah, I just don't know, because you don't see it all. But 95% at the least of my YouTube subscribers are people who I came up in their feed one day on YouTube, they liked what I said, and they pressed subscribe. And I thank those people. I love and appreciate those people that God has brought across my channel. But I'm doing all this on my own with no support, no cosign, no invites. I'm not included in anything by the people who you would think would include me. And none of that has been my reality for the past 3 years. Just ignored by all those who know me and could open a door, who God could use to open a door. But for God's reason, that has not been my story.